July 18, 1945. Camp Recklinghausen, British Zone, Germany. The barracks was silent. Not the peaceful silence of rest, but the heavy, suffocating silence of women who had learned that speaking, hoping, or feeling anything at all was dangerous. 237 German women sat on wooden bunks, staring at nothing, waiting for nothing, existing in the gray space between survival and death that prisoners of war learned to inhabit. Among them was a woman named Lieselotte Müller, 31 years old, a former auxiliary with the Wehrmacht, arrested by British forces in May 1945. She had spent the last 2 months in a series of holding camps, processing centers, interrogation rooms, places where the only sounds were orders, questions, and the occasional cry of someone being taken away for further questioning. Lieselotte had stopped feeling weeks ago, stopped hoping, stopped believing that anything beyond this gray existence was possible. She had learned to make herself small, invisible, silent, to answer questions with as few words as possible, to avoid eye contact, to become nothing more than a number in a ledger of defeated enemies. But then, on that July evening, something happened that none of the women expected. A British officer entered the barracks carrying something strange, a gramophone, an old, battered machine with a brass horn that looked like it belonged in a museum, not a prison camp. He set it up in the center of the room without explanation, wound the crank and placed a record on the turntable. The women watched in silence, confused, wary. Was this a test? A trick? Some new form of psychological torture? And then music began to play. Not a military march, not propaganda, but something achingly familiar. Mozart, eine kleine Nachtmusik, the same piece Lieselotte's mother used to play on the piano in their home in Dresden, the same piece she had heard at concerts before the war, when the world still made sense. The first notes hung in the air like a question no one knew how to answer. And then, all at once, the silence shattered. Women began to cry, not quietly, not with restraint, but with the kind of sobbing that comes from a place so deep you forgot it existed. Lieselotte found herself crying too, her hands pressed against her face, her body shaking with something she couldn't name. Grief, relief, remembering what it felt like to be human. If stories like this matter to you, listen closely, because this is not a story about mercy. It's not about forgiveness. It's about the moment when people who had been reduced to prisoners, to enemies, to numbers in a system, were reminded that they were human, that they had souls, that they could still feel something beyond fear and hunger and exhaustion. This is the story of German women prisoners of war who heard music for the first time in months, maybe years, and broke down because beauty, even in the middle of hell, is unbearable when you've convinced yourself you don't deserve it anymore. History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of Mozart playing in a barracks in Germany, the sound of women crying not from pain, but from the shock of remembering they were more than their uniforms, more than their guilt, more than the enemies the world needed them to be. The music filled the barracks like light filling a dark room. It moved through the space, touching everything, transforming the gray walls and rough bunks and exhausted faces into something that, for 3 minutes and 47 seconds, wasn't a prison at all. Lieselotte sat on her bunk, her hands gripping the edge of the thin mattress, her vision blurred with tears. Around her, other women were reacting in different ways. Some sat frozen, faces wet but silent, as if moving would break the spell. Others covered their faces with their hands and sobbed openly. A few stood and swayed slightly, as if the music was pulling them into a dance they could barely remember. One woman, a young girl, maybe 19, with hollow eyes and bones visible through her thin dress, began to hum along. Just the melody. Nothing more. But it was the first time Lieselotte had heard anyone in the camp make a sound that wasn't required, that wasn't forced. That came from choice rather than compulsion. The British officer who had brought the gramophone stood by the door, watching. His face was unreadable, not cruel, not kind, just observing. as if he was conducting an experiment and the results were uncertain. When the record ended, the barracks fell silent again. But it was a different kind of silence. Not the dead, heavy silence of before, but a silence filled with the echoes of what they had just heard, a silence that remembered music. The officer stepped forward. He spoke in German, heavily accented but clear. "You will have music each evening. 1 hour. You may request pieces if you wish. This is not a reward. It is not a privilege. It is recognition that you are human, and humans need more than food and shelter to survive." He picked up the gramophone and left without waiting for a response. For several minutes, no one spoke. Then, slowly, tentatively, the conversations began. Whispers at first, then voices. Women talking to each other about the music they had just heard, about pieces they remembered, about concerts they had attended, about mothers and fathers and siblings who had played instruments, about a world before the war when music was normal, not miraculous. Lieselotte turned to the woman on the bunk next to her, an older woman named Helga, maybe 50, who rarely spoke. "Did you hear it?" Lieselotte asked, her voice hoarse from crying. Helga nodded. "I heard it. Do you think it's real, or are we losing our minds?" Helga looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, something resembling a smile touched her face. "If we're losing our minds, at least we're losing them to Mozart. There are worse ways to go mad." That night, Lieselotte couldn't sleep, not from anxiety or fear, but from the strange, uncomfortable feeling of hope. Because if the British were giving them music, then maybe they weren't going to be executed. Maybe they weren't going to be left to rot in these camps forever. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future beyond the gray walls and barbed wire. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope. Because hope meant vulnerability. It meant allowing yourself to believe that things could get better, and that belief made disappointment unbearable. But Lieselotte couldn't stop it. The music had opened something inside her that she couldn't close again. They expected punishment. They expected to be treated the way German camps had treated prisoners, with cruelty, deprivation, and systematic dehumanization. They expected that being captured meant the end of any dignity, any humanity, any acknowledgement that they were more than enemies to be neutralized. But the British authorities in occupied Germany faced a problem. They had captured thousands of German women, not just soldiers and auxiliaries, but nurses, clerks, radio operators, factory workers who had been mobilized into the war effort. Women who ranged in age from teenagers to grandmothers. Women who were terrified, traumatized, and uncertain whether they would ever see their families again. And the question was, what do you do with them? The Geneva Convention had rules for male prisoners of war, but female prisoners were a gray area. There was little precedent, and the British government, still reeling from the liberation of concentration camps and the full revelation of Nazi atrocities, was caught between two impulses: the desire for punishment and the recognition that not all Germans were equally guilty. The decision they made was unexpected. Treat the women as prisoners of war, not as criminals. Provide basic necessities. Allow communication with families. And, in what would become one of the most controversial policies, allow cultural activities. Books, classes, music. The logic was pragmatic, not humanitarian. Prisoners who were given things to do, things to hope for, were easier to manage than prisoners who had nothing to lose. Despair made people dangerous. But hope, even small hope, made them cooperative. But the effect was profound, because women like Lieselotte had been living in a state of suspended terror for months. They had been told repeatedly that they were the enemy, that they were complicit in genocide, that the world hated them, and they deserved whatever punishment came next. And they believed it. They had internalized the guilt, the shame, the conviction that they were beyond redemption. And then someone played Mozart, and for 3 minutes and 47 seconds, They weren't enemies or criminals or guilty parties. They were just human beings listening to music, and that recognition, that acknowledgement of their humanity, shattered the walls they had built around themselves. Lieselotte learned later that the British officer who had brought the gramophone, a captain named James Hartley, had been part of the forces that liberated Bergen-Belsen. He had seen the horrors, the bodies, the survivors who looked more like skeletons than human beings. He had every reason to hate Germans, to see them as monsters, to treat them with contempt. But he had also seen something else, that the women in the camps were traumatized, broken, terrified, that many of them were barely more than girls, that treating them with cruelty wouldn't undo what had been done. It would only create more trauma, more hatred, more reasons for the cycle to continue. So he brought music, not as a kindness, but as a recognition, that these women, guilty or not, were still human, and humans respond to beauty. They need it. They break without it. One evening, several weeks after the first music session, Lieselotte was selected for an interview with a British liaison officer who was documenting conditions in the camps. The officer, a woman named Eleanor Price, asked her about the music program. "How does it make you feel?" Eleanor asked. Lieselotte struggled to find words. "Like I'm not just a number. Like I'm a person who did terrible things, yes, but still a person." "Do you think you deserve music?" Lieselotte shook her head. "No, but I'm grateful for it anyway, because it reminds me that the world still has beauty. And if the world still has beauty, then maybe there's a reason to try to be better, to live better." Eleanor wrote this down. Then she said quietly, "That's why we do it. Not because you deserve it, but because we need you to remember that you're human. Because if you forget that, if you believe you're nothing but guilty, then you'll never rebuild. You'll just carry the guilt until it destroys you. And Germany needs you to rebuild." The music program continued. Each evening for 1 hour, women gathered in the barracks and listened to records. Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Bach, music that had been composed by Germans for Germans in a time before Germany meant genocide and war. But not all the women welcomed it. For some, the music was unbearable, a reminder of what they had lost, what they had destroyed, what could never be recovered. One woman, a former SS auxiliary named Erika, refused to attend the music sessions. She sat in her bunk, her hands over her ears, her face twisted with something that looked like pain. When Lieselotte asked her why, Erika said, "Because it's a lie. The music pretends we're civilized, that we're cultured, that we're the people who created Bach and Beethoven. But we're not. We're the people who created Auschwitz, and no amount of Mozart changes that." Lieselotte didn't know how to respond, because Erika was right. The music was, in some ways, a lie, or at least a simplification. It suggested that German culture was about beauty and sophistication when recent history proved it was also about brutality and mass murder. But Lieselotte also believed that both things were true, that Germany had created Mozart and Auschwitz, that the same culture that produced sublime beauty had also produced unimaginable evil, and that acknowledging one didn't erase the other. She said as much to Erika. "Maybe we're both. Maybe that's the point. We're capable of beauty and horror, and if we only remember the horror, we'll never find our way back to the beauty." Erika looked at her with something like contempt. "You want to find your way back? There is no back. There's only forward, and forward means living with what we did. Forever." "I know," Lieselotte said, "but living with it doesn't mean we can only be that. We can be more than the worst thing we've done." "Can we?" Erika asked. "Or is that just what we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night?" The question haunted Lieselotte, because she didn't have an answer. She didn't know if redemption was possible, if transformation was real, if people who had been part of a genocidal regime could ever be anything other than guilty. But she knew one thing. The music made her feel something. And feeling something, even guilt, even shame, even the unbearable weight of what had been done, was better than feeling nothing, because nothing was death, and she was still alive. The music sessions began to evolve. At first they were passive, women simply listening to records. But after a few weeks something changed. One evening a woman named Frida stood up during a Schubert piece and began to sing. Not loudly, not perfectly, but she sang. And then another woman joined her, and another. And soon a dozen women were singing along, their voices rough and uncertain, but growing stronger with each note. Captain Hartley, who was present that evening, watched with an expression Liselott couldn't read. When the piece ended, he said in his accented German, "Tomorrow I will bring more records, and if any of you can play instruments, tell me. We will find instruments." Within a week, the camp had a small choir. Within a month, they had a string quartet, women who had played violin, cello, viola before the war, and were given instruments by the British authorities. The music sessions became performances, not professional, not polished, but real, human, alive, and something shifted. The women who participated in the music began to see themselves differently, not as prisoners, not as criminals, but as musicians, as singers, as people who could create beauty even in the middle of ruin. The music program at Camp Recklinghausen was not unique. Across the British and American zones of occupied Germany, similar programs were implemented in prisoner of war camps. The logic was consistent. Cultural activities reduced despair, improved cooperation, and prepared prisoners for eventual reintegration into society. But the programs were controversial. Many British and American citizens were outraged that German prisoners were being given music, books, and educational opportunities while their own countries were still recovering from the war. There were protests, editorials, demands that the programs be shut down, but the military authorities held firm, because they understood something that the public didn't, that punishment alone doesn't rebuild nations. That if Germany was going to be denazified, democratized, and reintegrated into Europe, then Germans needed to believe they were capable of being more than Nazis. And cultural programs, music, literature, education, were part of that process. By 1946, the music program at Camp Recklinghausen had expanded significantly. The choir performed for other camps, the string quartet played for British officers, and Captain Hartley, who had started the program with a single gramophone, had become an unlikely advocate for the prisoners under his supervision. In a letter to his commanding officer, Hartley wrote, "These women are not hardened Nazis. Most are just women who were caught up in a system they didn't create and couldn't escape. They carry enormous guilt. They are terrified of the future, and they expect us to hate them. But hatred is easy. Rebuilding is hard, and rebuilding requires us to see them as human." The music program is not about being kind. It's about being strategic, because women who remember they're human are women who can be trusted to rebuild a human society. The letter was leaked to the press and caused a scandal. Critics accused Hartley of being soft on Nazis, of sympathizing with the enemy, of betraying the memory of those who died fighting them, but Hartley defended his position. "I saw Bergen-Belsen. I know what Germans are capable of, but I also know that not every German is personally responsible for the camps, and treating them all as if they are personally responsible doesn't serve justice. It serves vengeance, and vengeance doesn't build peace." Liselott was released from the camp in September 1946, after 15 months of captivity. She returned to what remained of Dresden, a city that had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Her family's home was gone. Her mother was dead. Her brother was missing, presumed killed on the Eastern Front. She had nothing, no job, no home, no future, just the clothes on her back and a piece of paper certifying her release from British custody. But she also had something else, the memory of music. The memory that even in the worst circumstances, beauty was possible. And if beauty was possible, then maybe rebuilding was possible too. She found work with a choir in Dresden that was being reorganized. They performed in bombed-out churches and makeshift concert halls, singing for audiences who sat on rubble and cried because the music reminded them that Germany had been more than war, more than destruction, more than evil. And Lieselot sang, not to forget, but to remember. To remember that the same culture that had produced Hitler had also produced Mozart, and that the choice of which legacy to carry forward was hers. They called it captivity, but for many women it was the first time they had been safe in years, safe from bombing, safe from starvation, safe from the terror of knowing that at any moment Soviet forces might arrive and exact revenge for what German forces had done in the East. The irony was brutal. They were prisoners, but they were better fed, better housed, and better treated than most German civilians. They had regular meals, medical care, shelter, and music. Lieselot thought about this often. The absurdity of being grateful to her captors, the shame of living better as a prisoner than she had as a free woman in the final years of the war, the cognitive dissonance of hating the British for winning and being grateful to them for treating her with basic humanity. One evening, during a music session, a woman named Margaret said what many of them were thinking. "We don't deserve this." The room fell silent, because she was right. They didn't deserve music. They didn't deserve kindness. They didn't deserve anything except punishment for what their country had done, but Captain Hartley, who was present that evening, heard the comment. He stood and said, in his careful German, "You're right, you don't deserve this, but we're not doing this because you deserve it. We're doing it because we're civilized, because civilization means treating people as human even when they don't deserve it, especially when they don't deserve it." He paused. The Nazis treated prisoners as less than human. They justified it by saying those prisoners didn't deserve humanity. And we saw what that led to. We saw the camps. We saw the bodies. We saw what happens when you decide some people aren't human. He looked around the room. So we choose differently, not because you earned it, but because we refuse to become what we fought against. We refuse to let hatred define us. And if that makes us weak, if that makes us fools, then so be it. But we will not be monsters. The women sat in silence. Some were crying. Others looked away, unable to meet his eyes, because his words were both gift and condemnation, a reminder that they were being shown grace not because they deserved it, but because their captors were better than they had been. The music program continued until the camp was closed in 1947. By then, most of the women had been processed, interrogated, and released. Some were charged with crimes and sent to different facilities, but most were simply let go, with papers certifying they had been detained, questioned, and found to be low-level participants in the Nazi system. Lieselot kept in touch with several women from the camp. They wrote letters, met occasionally in the years that followed, and they all said the same thing, that the music had saved them, not from death, but from despair, from the belief that they were beyond redemption, from the conviction that they were nothing but guilty. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, a journalist tracked down Captain Hartley and asked him about the music program. Hartley, now retired and living in London, said, "People think I did it out of kindness, but I didn't. I did it out of necessity, because prisoners who have something to hope for are easier to manage than prisoners who have nothing to lose. The music wasn't charity. It was strategy." But then he paused. Though I'll admit, seeing those women cry when they heard Mozart, that changed me, because it reminded me that the enemy is still human. And if I forgot that, if I let myself see them as monsters, then I would become what they had been. And I couldn't let that happen. Lieselot Müller lived in Dresden for the rest of her life. She sang in the Dresden Philharmonic Choir for 40 years, performing throughout East Germany and, after reunification, throughout Europe. She never spoke publicly about her time in the camp. She never gave interviews. She never wrote a memoir. But in 1995, 50 years after the war ended, the Dresden Philharmonic organized a commemoration concert. Music after war. They invited survivors, veterans, and anyone who wanted to reflect on the role of music in rebuilding German culture. Lieselotte attended. She was 81 years old, frail, but still sharp, still able to sing. During the concert, the choir performed Eine kleine Nachtmusik, the same piece that had played in the barracks in 1945. And as the music filled the concert hall, Lieselotte began to cry. Silent tears streaming down her face, just as they had 50 years earlier. After the performance, a young journalist approached her and asked, "Why does this piece affect you so deeply?" Lieselotte thought for a long time. Then she said, "Because it reminds me of the moment I became human again. Not German, not a prisoner, not guilty or innocent, just human. Just someone listening to music and remembering that beauty still existed. And if beauty still existed, then maybe I could still exist too. Not as who I had been, but as someone new, someone better." The journalist asked if she could publish the quote. Lieselotte agreed, and the next day, newspapers across Germany printed her words alongside a photograph of her at the concert, tears on her face, surrounded by the music that had saved her life. She died in 2001, at the age of 87. At her funeral, the Dresden Philharmonic performed Eine kleine Nachtmusik, not as a dirge, but as a celebration, a reminder that Lieselotte had lived through hell and come out the other side still able to hear beauty. One of her fellow choir members said in a eulogy, "Lieselotte taught us that music isn't just entertainment, it's survival. It's the thing that reminds us we're human when the world tries to convince us we're not." She heard Mozart in a prison camp and decided to spend the rest of her life making music, not to forget what had happened, but to prove that what had happened wasn't the end of the story. She left the camp as a prisoner and spent her life proving that prisoners can become more than their guilt. There is a lesson here, a lesson about the difference between punishment and rehabilitation, between vengeance and rebuilding. The Allied forces that occupied Germany after World War II faced an impossible choice. How do you deal with millions of people who were complicit in a genocidal regime? How do you rebuild a nation whose culture produced both Mozart and Auschwitz? The easy answer was punishment, trials, executions, mass internment, collective guilt. And some of that happened. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted the leaders. Denazification programs identified and punished those most responsible. War criminals were executed. But for the millions of ordinary Germans, the women who had worked in factories, the men who had been drafted into the military, the children who had been indoctrinated in Hitler Youth, punishment alone wasn't enough, because punishment doesn't rebuild nations. It just creates resentment, bitterness, and the conditions for the next war. So alongside punishment, there was something else: rehabilitation, educational programs, cultural activities, opportunities to remember that German identity was more than Nazism, that Germans were capable of beauty, not just horror. The music program at Camp Recklinghausen was a small part of that larger effort, but it mattered, because it reminded women like Lieselotte that they were human, that they could feel, that they could create, that they were more than their worst moments. History doesn't repeat itself. It waits for those who forget to listen. And right now, in a world where we're constantly debating how to deal with people who've done terrible things, whether criminals, terrorists, or just people who've made bad choices, the story of music in prisoner of war camps matters more than ever, because it reminds us that rehabilitation requires more than punishment. It requires giving people a reason to be better, a reminder that they're capable of goodness, an opportunity to rebuild their sense of self around something other than guilt and shame. Lieselotte didn't stop being guilty because she heard Mozart. She didn't suddenly become innocent. The women in those camps didn't deserve the music they received, but giving them music created the conditions for transformation. It reminded them that they were human, and humans can change. The guard never sleeps, because the moment we decide that some people are beyond redemption, that punishment is all they deserve. that they're nothing but their worst actions. We make transformation impossible. We trap them in their guilt. We create people who have nothing to lose and no reason to be better. But when we recognize that even the guilty are human, when we give them something to hope for, when we remind them that they're capable of beauty, we create the possibility for change. Not guaranteed change, not easy change, but possible change. That's what Captain Hartley understood, that treating prisoners with basic humanity wasn't about being kind. It was about being strategic. Because you can't rebuild a nation with people who believe they're monsters. You can only rebuild with people who believe they're human. And humans respond to beauty. They need it. They grow from it. Lieselotte Müller heard Mozart in a barracks in 1945 and spent the next 56 years proving that prisoners can become more than prisoners, that Germans can become more than Nazis, that people can transform when given the space, the opportunity, and the reminder that they're still human. That transformation didn't erase what had been done. It didn't bring back the dead. It didn't undo the Holocaust. But it created a Germany that could acknowledge its past without being defined by it. That could remember its crimes without forgetting its culture. That could rebuild without pretending the war never happened. And that rebuilding started with something as simple as music. As Mozart. As a gramophone in a barracks where women who expected death found themselves crying because they remembered what it felt like to be alive. There are more stories like this one. Stories of people who were broken by war and rebuilt by small acts of humanity. If this matters to you, if you believe that rehabilitation is possible, that people can change, that even the guilty deserve to be reminded they're human, subscribe to Warden of War. The archive opens every week, and every story is a reminder that transformation is possible when we make space for it. Which story should we open next? Tell us in the comments, and let us know. Have you ever experienced a moment where art, music, or beauty reminded you of your humanity when you'd forgotten it? Share your story. Share this with someone who works in rehabilitation, in prisons, in systems designed to help people change. Because Lieselotte's story is a reminder that punishment alone doesn't transform people. Beauty does. Hope does. The reminder that they're more than their worst moments does.